So hi everyone. Just wanted to share something with us all, really, going into this perhaps unusual week ahead, not only in the lead up to Christmas, but with everything happening around COVID again, all the uncertainties around that. But really sensing there's something in this passage and this message of joy in dark times, this Advent message that I hope will speak to us all and maybe give us all something to take into the week ahead. So just suggest perhaps you pause and just read that passage first of all, and then come back and perhaps listen to these few thoughts that I wanted to share. But thinking about joy, but just starting with a thought about presents. I don't know how presents work with your friends and your families, whether they're things that are true surprises that you haven't asked for intentionally, and always the risk, I guess, that we end up with things that maybe slightly miss the mark and we didn't really want, and you've got to be polite and say thank you, but it's just not what you were hoping for. Or maybe you agree what you'd like to receive, and that element of surprise is totally gone. You get what you want, but the only surprise is maybe the wrapping that it comes with, and that's great, but maybe there's a loss of joy perhaps in that. And I think the art of presents, the best presents are those where the giver truly knows us and gives us something maybe that surprises us, which we really needed, which we really wanted, but perhaps hadn't even realised that. But speaking into the context that we're in, how can we talk as Christians about joy at a time like this, when events again seem to be overtaking us? There's a sense of deja vu. We can't quite believe we're back where we are at the moment. And yet I want to suggest that a message of joy is just exactly what we need at a time like this. And I think the sort of joy that we're talking about from a biblical perspective, from a Christian perspective, has to speak into moments such as the ones that we're living through. Because joy simply cannot be dependent on the good times only. What use would that be to us anyway? But the sort of joy that we're talking about from this passage today is certainly not only for the good times. Mary models that sense of joy for the dark times in our lives. Mary herself was a poor peasant girl, nothing obviously impressive about her. We'll talk about her posture towards God a little bit later. Her nation Israel, in a really dark time, overshadowed by a massive empire, the Roman Empire, that was denying agency and freedom for the people of Israel. And within that, just a sense of a loss, I guess, of identity, a loss of freedom, certainly. And of course, they had the temple that they could worship in, but as we saw in the series that we did on Ezra and Nehemiah, that turned out to be, really from the start, actually, quite a disappointment. And so much in that context in which there was an opportunity, not for joy, but for despair, really. There was a hope, of course, for a Messiah, some sort of leader who would come, but very much a hope against hope. And I guess when we think about in human history and recent history in the 20th century of dark and particularly bleak times, we tend to go to the Second World War and the Holocaust. And I remember reading as a young child, really, the incredible story of Corrie Ten Boom in her book The Hiding Place. And Corrie Ten Boom was once asked how she dealt with the horrors of the Nazi concentration camp that she and her family were in. And this is what she responded with. She said this: joy runs deeper than despair. There's a depth to the sort of emotion that we're thinking about this morning that we'll come to in just a bit. And I guess the root of that place where that joy comes from is an openness to God and a faith in God and a sense that God can be trusted even in the darkest of times. And this is what Corrie Ten Boom said: never be afraid to trust an unknown future to a known God. I guess if you take nothing away from these few minutes of thoughts, never be afraid to trust the unknown future again that we're in of these next few weeks, to a known God. And I guess Corrie Ten Boom, just like Mary, powerfully illustrates that sense that joy is not connected to external happenings or circumstances. It comes from somewhere very, very different. It's not about happiness in that sense. Happiness does tend to be about those happenings in our lives, but joy is about something very different. And in Nehemiah, the book that we just spent some time looking at, it says, the joy of the Lord is your strength. This sense that the core of our being is meant to come from this place where God provides that inner strength. It's not dependent on circumstances that come and go. There's a different reality going on within us. So joy isn't dependent on the good times. Rather, it's a gift from God. And not even a gift that we just need to sit back and wait for, but one that we can actively anticipate. I love this thought from John Calvin. There's not one blade of grass, there's no colour in this world that is not intended to make us rejoice. And even in the darkest times, there's always cause for joy in those little things, in the small things that happen around us. And maybe with the backdrop of such big things at the moment, that feels like a really trivial thought, but I don't think it is. I don't know whether you've ever noticed that people in the darkest of times, people where maybe they're coming to the end of life or they're in a place of long-term illness, what I notice is that suddenly those little things are the things that are observed far more keenly than ever before. Somehow, the darkness of those times throws everything into a different perspective, and the little things are really, really important. But I think Mary was certainly in this passage ready to receive the joy that would be contained in her, the joy that would be literally birthed within her. And hers was a life that externally wasn't impressive. I think that's the point of this story, but it was about her inner posture. She was open to God. She'd relinquished control of her life, and she was just willing to say yes to God, even in what was unexpected and what was unknown. And the result was the joy of this surprising, unknown, unexpected gift of the work of God in and through her. Like I said, the key to Mary, I think, is that inner posture. And I guess as I reflect on myself, when I go wrong, it's when my focus, my inner posture is directed in the wrong ways. So it goes inwards in defense, perhaps sometimes in despair. I turn inwards instead of outwards, and I sink down. It's easy, I think, so easy at the moment to be overwhelmed by all that goes on. But I think those emotions, we use language that has a direction to it. These experiences have a particular direction. So I said that despair causes us very often to turn inwards. But whenever we turn inwards, there's only such a limited space within us that very quickly we find things, I think, becoming really quite claustrophobic. But joy does something different. Joy opens us outwards into a really spacious place where we can live abundantly with God and abundantly with one another. And I talked about turning inwards rather than outwards, but also sinking down, that direction of downwards. That's got a direction to it. Obviously, we sometimes talk about, when we're feeling tired, we talk about feeling drained, and a drain obviously sucks everything downwards. But again, joy is different. Joy is like a well, like a wellspring, like a fountain that's deep within us that then rises up, not down. It rises up within us. And Mary's yes to God, her response to Gabriel in verse 38, where she says, I am the Lord's servant. May your word to me be fulfilled. That turned her outwards to God in faith and hope rather than inwards to herself. It resulted not in sinking down in despair, but joy rising up within her. And I think what happens when joy, we realise, isn't dependent on outward things, and we accept it and receive it as a gift from God that rises up within us, but then very quickly it simply can't be contained. It can't be contained within us as it rises up from within us. And we see this from verse 39 really in the passage this morning, almost impulsively, I guess. Mary, from verse 39, it says she hurries to a town in the hill country of Judea to be with her cousin Elizabeth. It's like she just can't stop herself. She just has to get there because this joy cannot be contained. It has to come out. It can't be kept in, and she has to share it with someone else. And then secondly, it just has to be expressed. I think again, joy has to be vocalized. We can't keep silence. It has to be put into language. And you see that from verses 42 to 45. Elizabeth rejoices in the favour of God upon Mary. She celebrates the child who will be born. She revels in the God who always keeps his promises. And joy is infectious, so that joy spreads from Mary to Elizabeth, but then it spreads even to the unborn baby within Elizabeth's womb, John the Baptist, as he'll be born. So that's Elizabeth's expression of joy. And then from verse 46, in one of the most famous songs in all of human history called the Magnificat, Mary celebrates this revolution of joy that is coming into the world because of God's work through Jesus Christ, turning the world upside down, or maybe we should think turning it the right way, as it's been turned the wrong way for too long. God comes to set things right and in their proper place. Verse 51, he scatters the proud but brings down the rulers from their thrones. Verse 52, lifting up the humble, filling the hungry with good things but sending the rich away empty. And ultimately again, God remembers his promises to his people, the promises made to Israel from the time of Abraham. And just a quick digression, just that sense of joy reminds me of the early church. It's actually interesting that the early church was not told very much in the New Testament to evangelize, to share the good news of Jesus. And yet we know it happens because the early church just grew massively. It grew exponentially. So how do we explain that? And I think for us, for whom sharing faith is all too often sometimes just seen as a duty, seen as like an obligation. But I think for the early church, there was just that wellspring of joy, that new life that had been birthed within them. And it rose up and it welled up and it had to come out. It had to be shared and it had to be expressed. And oh, that God would do that same work within us, that it isn't duty, it's joy. It's just overflowing joy. But as I sort of come to a close, really, I just wanted to share personal testimony, really, of how God does and can offer joy in the darkest of places. And I guess for me, the darkest time in my life so far was the illness and the death of my father, my dad, just over 9 years ago now. And I guess as I look back on that now, there's been lots to process. So there's been some significant journeying through this, but I do think back to the time of his suffering and ultimately his passing. And I guess what I look back on is a real sense of peace that I felt God gave me as a real gift, just a peace that we were being held within the love of God, that he was being held within the love of God throughout the worst of things. And I guess the ordering and the timing of things when he had a last seizure and ended up in hospital, and a place at the hospice opened up for him. And yet, even at the end, I think it wasn't just peace that I felt. It was something of joy, not like a hopping and leaping and skipping sort of joy, but a sense that all things did hold together, that there was a harmony, and somehow even a vibrancy of life, even through death and the worst of things that were happening. Little picture there on the left of the hospice that he stayed in, and we just saw those little glimpses of grace, those little treasures in the darkness, rainbows in the sky that just reminded us of the hope that we have. And even on the morning that he died, seeing a rainbow there in the sky. And then after he, I guess at the time of his passing, we said the Lord's Prayer together with sort of tears streaming down our eyes. And again, somehow a sense that God was able to take that and weave it into a much larger fabric and a much bigger picture than perhaps we could have ever imagined. And the passage that has stuck with me is this one from the Message in Colossians chapter 1. So spacious is he, so expansive that everything of God finds its proper place in him without crowding. Not only that, but all the broken and dislocated pieces of the universe, people and things, animals and atoms, get properly fixed and fit together in vibrant harmonies, all because of his death, his blood that poured down from the cross, that greatest gift of all, the gift of Jesus Christ, giving his life for us, somehow in inexplicable ways, that put back together again things that had become dislocated in the world. And I think that was what I felt I experienced at the time of my dad's death, that somehow even that could be put back together again. And I think that is the Advent hope that we carry. That's what Advent joy is about. It's deeper than happiness. It runs much deeper in us. But it can rise up within us to provide a vibrancy of life and hope, and hopefully spill over to other people, even in the darkest of times. And just to, I guess the other passage that came to me at the time of my dad's death was from Romans 8, and I think I really did experience that sense that, do you know what, there really is nothing that can separate us from the love of God. And Paul goes on to list all sorts of things that just can't do it. Life is one, but death is surely the ultimate. It's the ultimate thing that could bring an end to anything. But Jesus Christ has conquered death, and not even death has a sting for those who follow Jesus Christ. And I really felt that I experienced that. Not even death can separate us from the love of God. It's a hope that we carry that is beyond words, and it's a hope and a joy that I guess animated Mary, it animated Corrie Ten Boom, and it animated another woman called Julian of Norwich, who wrote many years ago now in the 14th century, but words that have stuck with us and provide such peace and hope and joy today. She wrote this: all shall be well, and all shall be well, and all manner of thing shall be well. She lived through the Black Death, a plague even more catastrophic than the one that we're living through at the moment. She lived through it at a time vaccinations and boosters were not even something that could be comprehended. But there is joy because she knows that not even death can derail God's plans and purposes for his creation. And one day we look to that day when all things will be turned back the right way around. All things that have become fragmented and dislocated will be fitted back together. Everything that has suffered death will receive life again in and through Jesus Christ. And I guess for Julian of Norwich, she knew that as a wellspring deep within her. It rose up in her and it overflowed, and it's brought blessing to so many people ever since. So as you enter this week, in which in one way so much is uncertain, and yet we feel that we know at least a sense of how things may go from here, I just wanted to pray God's blessing upon you, and maybe wherever you're sat, just perhaps if you're comfortable, put your hands out in front of you as a sign of faith, as a sign, like Mary, of being ready to receive a gift that is just exactly what you need at this time. So let me pray. So may you know the uncontainable joy of the Lord welling up within you, even in the darkest places and times of your lives. May you sense in ways that you cannot understand and cannot even begin to put into words that all shall be well, and all shall be well, and all manner of thing shall be well, because you know in the depth of your soul that truly nothing in this world and nothing in the next can ever separate us from the love of God in Christ Jesus. Amen. So if there's anything that we can do as a church to support you, please do get in touch. Please do make contact. If I don't see you before Christmas Day, hope and pray you have a wonderful Christmas with whatever happens. But may you know that deep peace and hope and joy of God. Do take care. God bless.